Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. Today we have the great pleasure of receiving Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whose books have been translated in more than 30 languages. You even made it on Barack Obama's top list books in 2018 with your bestseller Americana. Today you share your time between the United States and Nigeria. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
You are here attending the first night of Ideas in Washington. The theme is Facing Our Time. What is, according to you, one of the most important challenges of our time?
One of the things that I find most concerning is that I think critical thinking is in peril. I think that we have to be very careful that we don't lose sight of how important it is to think critically. I sometimes worry that technology means that we lose sight of empathy. And this evening I talked about how social media can sometimes make us forget that there's an actual human being on the other end. So that's, I think that the ability to think critically and then the ability to feel empathy, those are really important.
You're not a big fan of social media?
I'm not, no. But at the same time, I realize that it can be a good thing. So I think like most things in the world, it's not so much that it's inherently bad, it's how we use it. I think social media has helped people keep in touch, for example, and that's wonderful. But then on the other hand, it can really get ugly, and it can sometimes seem almost inhumane.
So I found your book, Americana, very relatable, especially when you describe and dissect America. And for instance, when you say that Americans talk with exclamation points, I think a lot of non-Americans living here can relate to some of your anecdotes. Did you expect that this book will touch so many people all over the world?
No. I'm very happy that it did, but no. I wrote it thinking, I'm going to write the book I want to write. And I was thinking, I'm probably not going to do very well with this book. But at the same time, so my book before Americana had done well, Half of a Yellow Sun. And so I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to write Americana because that's the book I want to write. Nobody will buy it, but that's fine because I'm still getting royalty checks from Half of a Yellow Sun. So I was actually very pleasantly surprised. And the reason that I didn't think people would like it is because I didn't want to follow the conventions. I think it's a book that, in talking about race and class and gender and all of the things that I talk about, and immigration, and there's a directness in the telling that isn't necessarily common. Actually, I like to say to people sometimes that French tradition of cinéma vérité, that in some ways I think Americana borrows from that tradition.
Talking about race too, you say that you realized that you were Black when you arrived in America as a student. Can you tell us what did you mean by that?
Because in Nigeria, I didn't think of myself as Black, because nobody thinks of themselves as Black in Nigeria. We have many problems, but race is not one of them, because I guess most people in Nigeria are Black. In many West African countries, we don't have race as an identifying part of us. So when I went to the US, all I had thought of myself was a Catholic and Igbo, and Nigerian, of course. But then in the US, people would just say things to me about being Black, and I would think, I don't even know what that means. But most of all, it was that I started to learn that Black wasn't a value-free idea, that to be called Black was that people made assumptions about you. There was a professor who was surprised that I wrote the best essay in class. And I realized that he was surprised because he didn't expect a Black person to write the best essay. And so for me, it was a learning process. Of course, now I very much identify as Black. And I've also come to learn about African-American history and to deeply admire that history is a history of African-Americans who are very resilient, who have systematically and consistently been undermined by the American state, and who continue to thrive. And I think that African-American history is under-celebrated.
So do you think that Trump's America, for instance, empowers public displays of racism?
Absolutely. We have to remember that it's in this period, in this presidency, that we have had people who parade publicly, and they are very open about being white supremacists. And it's important to remember that people have died, that a young woman was mowed to death by somebody who's a white supremacist, and that young woman who died was there to speak up about how important it was not to be racist. It's important to talk about just practical examples of how people's lives are affected by this new idea that it's okay to be racist.
What was your reaction when you heard Donald Trump referring to African nations as shithole countries?
Oh, I didn't have a reaction. I think that some things are not worth reacting to. Some things are just inconsequential.
And the immigration debate is raging in the United States, but also in Europe. What does it make you feel?
You know, I think it's a debate that has to have more nuance. And I think it's important for people in Europe in particular to remember that 100 years ago, they went to countries in Asia and Africa. They didn't have visas. They plundered. They invented countries. And in some ways, what's happening today is a consequence of that. That a lot of the conversations around immigration just demonize and make people who want better lives, make them seem like they're somehow criminal.
Do you think that France should review its relationship with Africa, that there is some hypocrisy?
You know, one of the things I find interesting is how often people talk about the idea that France is in control of the currency of many Francophone countries. I find that very curious because it seems to me that colonialism isn't over yet. I think there's something strange about lecturing a continent about good governance and at the same time participating actively in many examples of bad governance. And so it just seems to be a lesson in hypocrisy.
How did you see the United States change since you came here for the first time?
I feel gratitude to America. I always will, because America made me grow up, which was important. And America gave me opportunities. But it's also, I think, important to say that this is not a perfect country. And for me, the sadness is that it seems that I think that during Barack Obama's presidency, I felt, in particular, a sense of hopefulness. It doesn't mean that it was perfect. It just means that I think that leadership sets a tone. And I think the tone that was set in that administration was one of hopefulness, of inclusivity, of the idea that people mattered. I don't feel that way anymore. And for me, the sadness there is that I think that America is losing something. And I mean that ability to have soft power, that ability to make people think that by which I mean America, is the seat of justice. When I was growing up in Nigeria, I used to think, oh, that will never happen in America, when something, bad, political happened in Nigeria. But I don't say that anymore.
So that was my next question. As someone who comes from a country that has gone through unrest and authoritarianism, do you find sometimes similarities to the political atmosphere in America?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think the American president is very similar to an African big man in so many ways, sort of intentionally and stubbornly ignorant, very disrespectful of everybody else, that sort of thing. So there's a lot actually about the US, and even the idea that you have people who are your family members who are suddenly active in the government and nobody's quite sure why and what qualifications they have. That's very familiar to me as a Nigerian, as an African. And I think if there's a lesson there, it's simply that democracy is so fragile.
And when you see so many women, a record number of women who have been elected to the new Congress, what do you think allowed this to happen, and what do you think it says about the future of the country?
Many women were forced awake when they realized that there was a lot that was, there are many rights that women have that are now potentially in jeopardy. I'm very excited about the number of women who are becoming politically active. I find it very exciting because I think it's long overdue, quite frankly. But also because it's wonderful to know that women can now run as individuals rather than running as the woman candidate. In the end, I think my idea of feminism is one in which people can be individuals. So I find it very exciting, and I'm kind of looking forward to what will happen.
So you're a global icon of feminism. Your book, We Should All Be Feminist, started a worldwide conversation on feminism. You even inspired Dior for a T-shirt, Beyoncé for a song. Is it sometimes difficult for you to deal with the feminist label attached to you?
Yes, yes. Because it's a label that, I mean, I've been feminist since I was old enough to think. I realize that that word feminist is very contested. It means different things for people. It has often very negative connotations. You know, fundamentally, I'm a storyteller. I'm an artist. And it's hard to be caged in by a label. And to be called that, an icon, often means to be one thing in a narrow way. And sometimes it can be difficult.
So do you think the Me Too movement is a global movement, or do you think it mainly impacted the US?
I think it's mostly Western. I don't think it's quite taken off in Africa, in Asia, even in Latin America. But it's coming. And for me, it's very moving because, and even just writing about feminism as I do and getting responses from just the most interesting and varied places and realizing that women in these places are thinking about these things as well.
So you feel that things are changing?
I do. I do. Slowly, too slowly, but yes, I do.
And you, a friend asked you once your advice on how to raise her daughter, and you transformed that into a manifesto. Today you have a daughter. Yes. Will you give her the same advice, and what will it be mainly?
Yes, well, she's just 3 years old, so there's time. But what I wrote in it are things I still deeply believe in, which is the idea that, you know, you have a daughter, and I think it would be the same in many ways for a son. Because I think it's also important to raise boys to be feminist, and to raise boys to be vulnerable, to raise them to know that it's okay to cry, you know, to raise them, to give them the language to express emotion. We do not give boys that, and I think it's a shame. And for girls to sort of teach them that you can be yourself, you don't have to pretend so that somebody will like you. And I think it's important to be honest about conversations that are about feminism and raising children, because the world isn't feminist, right? And when you're trying to raise a child to see that gender should not hold you back, it's difficult. You sometimes feel as though the world is against you. Yeah.
That's some very wise words. Thank you so much, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, for your time. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you for being with us. Stay tuned on France 24.